Hi, and welcome to Terrorism Challenges to Stability and Diplomacy. This is Chapter 12, Future Trends and Projections. So, the chapter begins talking about, the differences between the old terrorism and the new terrorism to try and think about how we could project out into the future. And first, they want to talk about cautioning between notions of projections and predictions. Okay, and so first they say that projections involve theoretical constructs of trends based on available data. Okay, and that predictions are practical applications of data, that is intelligence, to anticipate specific behaviors by extremists. Okay, so those are two very different things. So again, a projection is a theoretical idea, and a prediction is something that is more based in some sort of evidentiary analysis, okay, that they have some sort of intelligence, evidence that has allowed them to come to some sort of very specific prediction, okay. So what we're doing here is we're projecting, okay, because we don't have specific evidence that we're looking at. Well, we kind of do, but we don't have, this is something that's constantly changing, okay? So we're just going to project, cast a wide net and project out into the future, okay? So again, concepts of the old terrorism, you've got this chart on page 263. So the old terrorism, as it says here, was in many ways symmetrical, predictable, and it was not characterized by terrorist environments, exhibiting mass casualty rates, or indiscriminate, like how we see now. We can think of the recent Sri Lanka attacks. Its organizational profile was also characterized by traditional organizational configurations. So this table sort of looks at the old terrorism versus the new terrorism and sort of compares and contrasts them. Okay, so we look here, we can see that the old terrorism, that its target selections tended to be surgical and symbolic, though sometimes you can see in the new terrorism that can be the case too, right? So if we look at the Sri Lanka terrorist attack that just occurred, those were very symbolic. They did target churches. Okay, so that does happen in the new terrorism. We do see symbolic, but they weren't necessarily indiscriminate. Okay, so casualty rates, low and selective in the old terrorism. You had to, in those instances, it tended to be far fewer people, and they were highly selective. They tended to be more military targets than large numbers of civilians, say, for example. Okay, the organizational profile tended to be hierarchical and identifiable. It was easy to know who was who. There was a specific hierarchical structure, and you would know, for example, if somebody died, you would know who was going to take over that person's place. Tactical weapons, they tended to be very conventional, low to medium yield profiles as far as how much either ammunition or what their kill rate would be. Typical motives, they either tended to be leftist or ethnocentric. And obviously, as we've been talking about in the new terrorism, we're seeing very indiscriminate, still symbolic, but the targets can be very indiscriminate. Okay, they don't necessarily care about who gets hurt in the process. They may have somebody specific that they're interested in, but they aren't as concerned about collateral damage. Okay, casualty rates as a result tend to be very high and again very indiscriminate. Their organizational profile, they tend to be very cellular, meaning they operate in cells, okay, or they can be very lone wolf in structure or non-structure, as the case may be, okay, just one person or two people, okay. Unconventional and high-yield tactical weapons. So it could be something where they just, made a bomb out of a pressure cooker in their kitchen, like the Boston bombers. Or it could be high-yield weaponry. And typical motives tend to be sectarian. Okay, like we can think of between religious groups in particular. All right, so again, if we think about the recent Sri Lankan attacks, it was Muslims versus Christians. Okay. So, what does the future hold? So this whole next section that we're going to talk about, you can look at for more details on page 263 to 270. We're just going to kind of gloss over this a little bit. So the sources of extremist behavior, they haven't really changed in the recent past, and they're not going to change in the recent future. So the main things that you're going to see, they could be things related to and we'll talk about these things in a second, state-sponsored terrorism, dissident terrorism, religious terrorism, ideological terrorism. Okay. Again, examples could be things like, whether it's the leftists with environmental, which, tends to have low rates of injury and stuff like that. But the bigger things that we're going to be looking at into the future in relation to that in the United States, for example, or worldwide, because these leftist type organizations exist across the globe. If you're looking at left-right placement in relation to terror, the bigger concern, not just in the United States but globally, is the extreme right placement. Those are the ones that are becoming a greater threat, more violent, and those are the ones that we need to look at that we have a greater concern about in relation to potentiality for greater violence. Okay, we're seeing an increase through CIA, for example, the United States, through CIA and FBI data, an increase in hate crimes against Jews, against Muslims in this country. That's again according to their own data. We're seeing similar patterns across the EU, inside specific countries like Germany, Sweden, even, believe it or not, definitely France, the UK, etc. We're seeing increased patterns, and it's coming from these extreme alt-right groups, okay, against Jews, against Muslims. So these are the concerns that we're seeing on the left-right placement, for example. We'll talk about that, or maybe I'll just skip over it since I'm going into so much detail about it right now. So many people will continue to see political violence as a justifiable option. That's unfortunately the way of things, and particularly, unfortunately, when you have people in political office who, push these types of agendas, justify political violence as an option, saying that this is an okay thing to do, then this is one thing that's going to help spur these types of actions. obviously, especially when you're talking about the left-right placement types of violence. The likelihood of political violence is going to remain high. Um, so again, when you're talking about, we can skip about the ideological terrorism, so I've been talking about that. Um, Religious terrorism, that's something that is going to just unfortunately continue. We don't see that staving off anytime soon. Obviously, the Sri Lankan attack is an example of this. We see, even though President Trump recently claimed ISIS had been defeated, this was, among many terrorist experts, a complete falsehood and should never have been said, because even though you can remove ISIS's territory, all right, um, they are bigger than just their territory. And while that might have been a claim of theirs and something that they considered a prize for them to have gained, okay, that a terrorist movement isn't just territory, all right? As a matter of fact, territory is really more of the cherry on the icing on top of a sundae, okay? That you remove that and it's still going to be a sundae, okay? So it's not going to mean it's not a terrorist group anymore. In fact, in some ways, it helps free up ISIS to become more of an effective terrorist organization, because before, when it's chained to a set of boundaries and it's trying to maintain those boundaries, then it becomes a situation where it's trying to maintain the state. And if you've taken my introduction to comparative politics class at all, and we've talked about the modern state, you know about all of those Weberian characteristics of the state and all of that. And we've talked about that a little bit here, having territory, bureaucracy, and legitimacy, and all of those things. And it's takes significant resources, significant time, and not having to do that, right? They are still very wealthy. So now they can take that considerable amount of wealth that they have. They still have a considerable amount of people who are true believers, okay? And they can retreat back, recruit again, all right? And do what they've been doing best all along, right? And that is to export terror, train people to commit acts of terror, and or what they've been doing over the past couple of years when, when they were having difficulty holding on to the state, right? And they stopped encouraging people to come to the Levant, right, their area. And that is to have people commit acts of terror at home. And they would train people online, right? Or if people had come to Syria already to train, they'd been training people in years past, or training them in the far reaches of Iraq, or, whatever, right? Training them in terrorist methods, or training them online, like I said. They have a book you can download on the internet, all right, on how to make bombs and all of this. They'll Skype with you. And so they are very much alive, okay? And they will continue to do what it is that they do, and continue to commit acts of terror against us, against anybody that they feel that they'd like to commit acts of terror against, that they feel would be easy, good targets, all right? Um, if they can get people in the United States, or Muslims in the United States, to download these books and to commit acts of terror at home, that would be a wonderful thing for them too. Okay, and they will fund these people just like they did, supposedly, in the Sri Lankan situation. Okay, and this is what they do. All right, and so there's no reason to doubt that this is not going to continue. ISIS has tons of money. Al Qaeda, it's the same situation. Later, we'll talk about this notion of how to defeat terrorism, this notion of, it's a term that they use, decapitation, right? That's to kill the head of the terrorist group. But really, when you do something like that, like I've talked about in chapters past, another head will grow up and come in its place. Just like with Al Qaeda, Osama bin Laden's son, one of his many sons, okay, has come up and is now the head of Al Qaeda, and they are a wealthy terrorist group as well. And you may hobble them for a period of time, which is another concept in counterterrorism. But you have to kill the idea when it comes to counterterrorism, and if you cannot kill the idea, then the idea will persist. All right. And so long as they can continue to recruit, so long as they have the money, okay, which we'll talk about later, trying to cut off their access to money, etc. So long as they have all of these things, there is no reason to doubt that they will continue to be a threat. So it's not appropriate to say ISIS has been defeated, because they have not been. Even in the region, they still are active, and are still a threat. So we can look at dissident terrorism. I'm going up the other way. Thinking about, for example, we can think about taking a step back from Islamic or religious, from that perspective. Think about other forms of religious dissident type terrorism. We can look at the situation in North and South Ireland, right? Well, actually, the country of Ireland versus North Ireland, okay, and how that relates to Brexit. One of the problems that people have been having and are very concerned about in relation to if Brexit were to go through, that there would be dissident terrorism that would return in Ireland. There was the time of Troubles, where there was a great amount of violence between the North and the South. Eventually, Ireland became Ireland and gained its independence. Okay, there are Catholics in the South and Protestants in the North, and Ireland was wanted it to gain its independence because of years of oppression that it felt that it had, both cultural and religious, against the British Crown, or from the British Crown. Eventually, it did gain its independence, etc. But it was, there was that tension between the Catholics and the Protestants, etc. And the thing that everybody talks about that made that tension and that violence, the terrorism that was actually going on between the North and the South, go away, right, was the elimination of the border between the North and the South that existed. So Ireland is its own country, belongs to the EU. And then England, as part of Great Britain, belongs to the EU. And then the free flow of movement between the two countries. Okay. But if Britain were to Brexit, okay, and leave the EU, there would be a return of a hard border between the North and the South. And everybody talks about that. The only sort of The only thing that keeps that tenuous peace is that border, is the removal of the border, excuse me, between the North and the South, and that if that were to return, that could become a major problem, and that violence would definitely return. We already saw the assassination of a reporter not long ago um, in the north of Ireland. So things are already heating up. So this is something to look out for. Obviously, even though Ireland and um, um, North Ireland are technically now two different countries, it's still um, part of the same island, and still culturally they're the same ethnic group, right? So, anyway, another form of dissident type terrorism would be like the Russian situation with the Chechens. Okay, that is something that could potentially still be going on related to Chechen dissidents, or those who are returning from Syria and Iraq who were members of ISIS, those who did decide to make that choice, or if any from Ukraine who were fighting for Ukraine were to return. And perhaps if they were to join a rebel movement or something like this, that would be something to look out for. State-sponsored terror, there's no reason, of course, to believe that that's going to change as well. So, world in conflict, future sources of terrorism. Obviously, the situation between Palestine and Israel is only getting worse. Okay, particularly with Netanyahu getting another term as prime minister, President Trump supporting the annexation of, or just absorbing the Golan Heights, and also talking about absorbing the West Bank. And President Trump is not interested in caring about any of those things. That is something that's really going to spur additional violence in Palestine and Israel. That's not a tenable situation. Latin America with the necro, or I can never say that word. It's on page 260. What page is that? I have to look at it. Narco traficantes. Okay. So Europe, again, that's all talking about what I was talking about before with the rise of the extreme right and the anti-immigrant fervor. That's a huge concern there. And Africa also has the ethno-nationalists there, problems in Sierra Leone, so please take a look. They're on page 266. And Asia, also on page 266, and we've talked significantly about the case of the United States, and just have a look on that on page 267, just in interest of time. So information technologies, this is going to have a lot to do with concepts of cyber terrorism. This is a huge emerging field. We have to be concerned about other countries hacking into our weapons technologies, into our databases, etc. We've seen everything from minor things, like recently the Russians like screwing with our naval GPS units. So they're trying to screw with like our naval GPSs, so that our boats don't know what true north is, and so when they're navigating, when they look at their things, they think it would seem as though they're in the middle of a landmass when they know clearly they're not. Okay, and they were able to trace this back to Russian Russian intelligence and stuff. And so this is the kind of thing that we're talking about here. Everything from something like that to it could be like kids just screwing around, um, with an axe to grind, um, or something more serious where they're trying to get into our weapons technologies. So these are various serious type things. We also need to think about like EMPs, which are the electromagnetic pulses. These are things where they can activate them, and then when they do, it kills everything electrical around it. That would obviously be something very serious. All like computers or submarines or boats, battleships, like everything would go dead. I mean, you can imagine, for example, like a submarine or something in the middle of, the ocean, and, that would be just a bad situation. So, but then they could also do this on a larger scale, on a city scale or something like this. So, these are very terrifying type technologies. Liquid metal embrittlement, where they could put this on something metal and then it would cause it to shatter. So you could think about this being deployed on something like an airplane or a boat or something like this, and it causing it to break and fall apart. Okay, so Ch12Terr, feasibility versus likelihood. So we talked a little bit about this. Um, so it's harder to do things like, steal nuclear weapons. So your book talks a little bit about that. Trying to steal those or trying to replicate those in some way, though they could make like dirty bombs or something like that. So that's a little bit more feasible. But the thing that to really look out for is like the cyber terrorism type stuff. Like I said, even kids, really savvy kids with an axe to grind could and have engaged in this type of behavior. So, breaking into government computers and things like this. So this is a real and viable threat. So soft targets and symbolism, you can look at that on page 269. The future of international terrorism in the United States. We talked about this, the left versus the right already, so I'm going to skip that. We talked about this, the left and the right. Okay, so on page 271, we talked about some of these notions. So the continued utility of force, for example, like you're always going to have to, in some instances, you're not going to be able to just deal with terrorism by, dealing with it behind the scenes, either, uh, through computers or trying to neutralize a threat some other way. Sometimes you're going to actually have to get boots on the ground and actually fight people. And so that's what that concept is, and that's what that's talking about. Countering terrorist financial operations, that's like, trying to get rid of their financial streams of how they get their money, right? If you can disrupt their financial operations, and particularly if you can eliminate them in any way, shape, or form, that would obviously be ideal. But putting the biggest dent in them as possible would be a huge blow to any terrorist operation. It prevents them from being able to fund various terrorist operations, whether it be sending people overseas for training, whether it be funding specific bomb making fissile material, this sort of thing. Okay. counter-terror surveillance technologies, investing in that, and um, uh, you know, deploying those. And your book talks more about the case for international cooperation. Um, Obviously, that that should be um, that should be a priority, right? That we should be working together, all law enforcement, international law enforcement cooperation, because this is going to give um, all states the biggest access to all information needed um, to help fight this threat, obviously. Okay. So they talk about, as I said before, this idea of like decapitation, which I said isn't necessarily super effective. Dealing with negotiations, that's where you're um, interrogating the extremist movement into legitimation or legitimate political process. You're trying to get them to work somehow with the system, right? So they're doing this in some way in Afghanistan right now. They're trying to get the Taliban, they're trying to make peace with them, to maybe get them to work with the political system there, to allow the state to function in some way, shape, or form, right? So success, they say, is defined when the movement achieves its goals, and thereby its definition of its success. And failure is group implosion, obviously, okay, because of mistakes, burnout, or collapse, or marginalization when the group loses popular support. So obviously, if people stopped believing in ISIS or Al Qaeda or whatever, that would be a failure. Repression, defeat of the movement with force, and reorientation, that's transitioning of a movement from terrorism to another form of violence. So they might move from terrorism to political violence, okay, instead. So you can look at government responses versus societal responses on page 271 to 272. And all of this stuff is on page 272 to 273. Okay. All of this we've talked about in some way, shape, or form. So I talked about the continuing utility of force. You're going to have to use it sometimes. We've talked about countering their financial operations. We've talked about this, finding their hidden fortunes wherever they are. Okay. Osama bin Laden was super rich. If we could have, if we can, get a hold of that and cut it off, that would be great. If we could get a hold of ISIS's vast fortunes, okay, and cut that off, that would be beneficial as well. So there's a case on page 275. There's these two cases I'd like you to look at. So again, Echelon, that was this sort of wiretap. Was that it was this NSA satellite surveillance system, okay, that they put into place. All right, and it's very, very capable. There's some people who like it and some people who don't, but please take a look at that, just in interest of time. I'm not going to completely go over that. We talked about the case for international cooperation. All right. Terminal institutions, prisons are examples of that. All right. That's on page 276. All right. So if you have any other questions, please let me know. And it's been a great semester, and I really had a good time. And if you have any questions about your paper, or if you need to Skype me about it, please don't hesitate. I love Skyping with my students, so please let me know. Thanks.